sorry? This mic was off, and now, so I had it on just now, and then I turned it off. But this mic is on. I can't control it. I'll just try not to say insulting things about other people while I'm up here. Yeah, we got to keep it on, though, because she's about to talk. Tatev, I think let's not overthink the microphone thing at this time. But we're about to start. Thank you.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine. It's actually got quite good acoustics. You can't necessarily shout. Hi, good morning, everybody. Everybody in the room, everybody on the live stream. Welcome to the 2018 Ranking Digital Rights Report on the Corporate Accountability Index. My name is Ellery Biddle. I'm director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism here at Columbia Journalism School. Before we start, I just wanted to say a word about our colleagues on the picket line outside who are members of the graduate or hoping to be members of the Graduate Workers Union and getting recognition from Columbia. We were, I think, like many of us, I was caught this morning between obligation and solidarity. But I did say that I think we'd all be articulating here our support for organised workers and for their right to protest and be heard and be recognised, because that's actually a very important part of what we'll be talking about today. This has only been going for 3 years, but it is always a very closely followed event in the calendar of people who care about freedom of expression and online freedoms. It is the work of Rebecca MacKinnon and her team at Ranking Digital Rights. Rebecca needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. She is, as many of you know, I like to call her a lifelong journalist because that's how I think of her, but also a scholar and thought leader. She started, she was one of the founders of Global Voices Network, which was just an incredibly important intervention in how we think about journalism in undercovered markets and how we enable people on the ground there. As I say, this is her third year of producing this amazing piece of work. I did say to Rebecca, how is everything else going? And she said, there is nothing else. And in a minute, Rebecca will talk us through the main findings. And then immediately after that, we have two really fantastic discussants from, if you like, sort of, I think both broadly and, well, very much in sympathy with the aims of the report, but also from different sides of the fence. So Anil Dash, to my immediate left, who it's just slightly odd for me to be sitting next to somebody I normally only ever see on Twitter, but who does actually exist in the real world. It's slightly unsettling for me. Anil has a background in both software development, but also is a great thinker and advocate for the idea of free expression online, and his company currently supports a platform called Glitch, which is all about free expression in the real world. So he comes from the perspective of being a company trying to do the right thing, both domestically and internationally. And then next to him is Ellery Biddle. Welcome, Ellery, who's done really fantastic things with her wet hair this morning. She is the director of Advox, which again, sorry, it's just Rebecca and I were slightly envious of the fact she sort of was able to not look like she'd been in a rainstorm. And Ellery is the director of Advox, which again is another great organisation, which is and Global Voices, which is, as I say, sort of carrying the baton from the days of Rebecca and Ethan Zuckerman founding it, and also providing just incredibly important support on the ground, but also an incredibly important feed of information for those of us who are monitoring what it really means to be a journalist or be a commentator on the ground in what are increasingly difficult circumstances. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca, who is going to talk us through the findings. Make notes of questions that you might have, and we will, as I say, discuss those among us, and we want to bring you into the conversation as soon as possible. Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks to all of you for being here. And again, we apologize. It had been our understanding that the picket line for the strike was not extending to this area, which is not on the main campus. And we have tremendous sympathy and support for the cause of the striking graduate students and their desire to have a union, and we hope that the university will do the right thing. Before I start, I actually have a very long list of thank yous. I'm going to save most of them to the end, sort of like a movie credit rolls, because I was criticized last year for spending too long thanking before I got to the point. But I do have two thank yous I do need to say at the beginning. One is Agnes Calamar and Holly Johnson of the Columbia Global Freedom of Expression Initiative, who welcomed us here to... And thank you so much to kick off our 2018 Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index at the beginning of this conference, and gathering of extraordinary activists and leaders and scholars in the freedom of expression space. It's a real privilege to be able to join your conference, and I thank you so much. Also, I thank Jolie McPhee of the Internet Society and the Internet Society for doing the podcast, for doing the webcast. This is being live streamed around the world, and so there are people watching and hopefully reacting on Twitter, and we'll be able to get people's reactions. So hello world out there, and thank you to the Internet Society for live streaming this event, and for all the live streaming that the Internet Society does of events related to the Internet around the world. It's really an essential service. And I'm going to embarrass my team later by thanking them all by name, but I'm going to start getting into the substance so that you will admire their work all the more when I thank them by name later, because you will have seen what the fruits of their labor have been. So, I'll just get my clicker here. So what is this about? There's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of attention given to the clash of government power and corporate power over the governance of our digital lives. That's been a real dominant theme in the news lately, as really symbolized by Mark Zuckerberg's hearings in Congress and the clash of worlds that we saw there. Now, this map is a version of a map that's put out twice a year by a social media marketing entrepreneur in Italy. And I like to show his maps. This is the latest iteration. And the blue is all the countries where Facebook is the most popular social network in that country. And then you have China and Russia as the holdouts with Contactia, which is owned by Mail.ru, and Qzone, which is owned by Tencent. And then you have a little bit of Instagram and Odnoklassniki, which is another Russian language thing. But basically, Facebook is the sovereign of our social media space in the world. This is a map of the top global websites, the most popular websites per country, according to the Alexa ranking. And all of that blue is Google. So in all the countries that are blue, Google is the most popular, most visited website in the world, Google search. The pink is YouTube, also owned by Google, and the orange is Baidu in China, and the green is VKontakte, again, the Russian social network. So that kind of gives you a sense of this, I think, sort of when we look at these maps, we get a sense of the clash of sovereignties that are going on and the power that some of these platforms have over our lives. Which brings us to ranking digital rights and our index. So we're evaluating 22 of the world's most powerful internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies on their disclosed commitments and policies that affect their users' freedom of expression and privacy. And you'll be able to see the list in this handout that we put on everybody's chair, so you don't have to squint and memorize the names of the companies there. But having seen those other maps, that kind of helps give you a sense of why we chose this particular set of companies due to resources. Of course, if we could rank many more companies, we would, but this is what we were able to do. So we have a range of the widest ranging, most popularly used US-based platforms, plus Apple, which of course is the most popular mobile phone platform, in addition to Samsung, which we also cover from South Korea. We also, because of that map, you'll see we needed to look at some Chinese and Russian internet and social media companies. So we have 2 Chinese and 2 Russian internet platforms in the ranking. And then we rank 10 telecommunications companies which have been selected for distribution and reach. So the idea is that when you add up these 22 companies, both the telecommunications companies that people depend on to access the internet platforms and use their network devices, plus the platform, the biggest, most powerful platforms themselves, you get a collection of companies that are shaping the digital lives of the majority of the world's internet users. So that's the rationale for our selection. And we looked at the mobile ecosystems of Google Android as well, in addition to Apple and Samsung, which uses Google Android. And so we evaluated these 22 companies across several services each, and as well as their group level, corporate level policies. And so that's kind of the range there. And the point of evaluating them on their commitments and disclosures is simple but important. Because when power is exercised on us, either by companies directly for their own business reasons, or by governments, or by other third parties that are using or manipulating these platforms, we need to know. We need to know who can exercise power over our digital lives under what circumstances. We need to be able to understand who's exercising this power if we're going to hold power accountable. And so a key to that, of course, we need government transparency. We need governments to respect rights. And there are a number of indexes, Freedom House and others, that are looking at that. So we're focusing on our companies being maximally transparent about all the ways that their businesses and their interactions with other actors, such as governments, in the course of doing their business operations, may affect users' privacy and freedom of expression. So that's the point of the index and the questions we ask. So here is the overarching score. We asked 35 different questions that we call indicators, and when you add up the answers, the scores for all 35 questions, this is how it stacks up. But what's actually more interesting, and you can, again, see the ranking on here, so you don't need to squint, and those watching on the webcast can go to rankingdigitalrights.org and peruse all the data. But what gets more interesting is when you dig down into the specific questions and the categories. So in this slide, you have the overarching score on the left, but then you have the questions, the indicators divided into 3 different categories. One category is governance. So we're looking at, does the company have an overarching commitment to users' freedom of expression and privacy as human rights? Do they carry out due diligence, risk assessment on, what are the ways in which a user's freedom of expression or privacy might be put at risk in the course of the business operations? Is there board and executive level oversight over these risks and impacts? Are there effective grievance mechanisms? Is there stakeholder engagement? Are companies part of formal multi-stakeholder initiatives that actually verify and help them advance their commitments? And so on. So that's what governance is looking at. And you'll see that companies aren't stacking up in the same order in governance as they are in their overall scores. Freedom of expression, it's not free for all. Who allows the most speech of all kinds gets the prize. That's not the point. We're talking about freedom in the context of human rights, right? So we expect that there are rules, that it shouldn't be allowed that you use your social media account to organize a massacre against your neighbors. That is not a human rights compatible exercise of freedom of expression. But when there are limits, they need to be necessary and proportionate. When governments are making demands of companies, it needs to be transparent about how that relationship is happening. And companies need to be clear with their users about what the rules are that they're setting themselves for behavior on their platforms and networks, how those rules are enforced, and the volume and nature of content being removed. And there needs to be, again, risk assessment and engagement with stakeholders about how these rules are being enforced if we are going to ensure that freedom of expression is respected for users on these platforms and networks. And then privacy is looking at 3 different buckets. We look at what's often called consumer privacy, or some people shorthand these days call the Facebook data issues. So the entire life cycle of people's data. Is the company being maximally transparent about what it's collecting, with whom it's sharing, what it's doing with your data, and giving you maximum control and agency over what's collected and shared and what happens to your data? And then we're also looking for transparency about government demands. So are companies issuing thorough transparency reports about the volume and nature of user information they're being asked to take down, to hand over to governments? And we're also looking at security. So are the companies showing clear evidence that they are making maximum efforts to secure user data? And I'll show some examples here. The index with 35 questions, obviously I'm not going to go through the results of everything here. I'm going to kind of give some highlights. So what's very interesting is that this year, the 2018 index ranked the companies, evaluated companies on the same methodology as we used last year. And there's been quite a bit of improvement, actually. 17 of the 22 companies showed improvements. And online and in the report, you'll be able to see more detail about exactly how each company improved. What's quite interesting on the telecommunications side is you see 3 European telecommunications companies had the most improvement: Telefonica, Vodafone, and Orange. And in large part, that's because they joined something called the Global Network Initiative. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we also saw a fair amount of improvement from Chinese companies Baidu and Tencent, which is very interesting. The indicators they improved on were not related to government demands. They're really not capable, in a position to be more transparent about government demands, but everything related to kind of commercial data collection, in terms of service enforcement and security, they're actually starting to compete with one another on. So that's very interesting. And we know that while they don't engage with us formally, we know that they're paying attention to their results. So it's an interesting example of where we're managing to have impact in some unexpected places. So coming back to the governance results, that first category, what's been very interesting to see is the extent to which companies that are members of the Global Network Initiative, which is an initiative that gets companies to make commitments to respect freedom of expression and privacy in the context of government demands. So when governments are asking companies to censor content or hand over user data, are they conducting due diligence? Are they pushing back? And are they being maximally transparent? Do they conduct human rights impact assessments? And we're seeing much more thorough governance structures and practices taking place among Global Network Initiative companies than other companies. So that's an interesting thing to think about. It's also interesting on the very specific question of, does the company conduct a comprehensive human rights impact assessment that covers both privacy and freedom of expression, and not just government demands, but terms of service enforcement and other commercial practices. There's variation among the Global Network Initiative companies, but the evidence of human rights impact assessment by non-GNI companies is quite scant. So that kind of points to an effect that the GNI is having on companies actually at least putting, not that they're perfect, you know, when things play out, as we know, but at least that there's oversight and impact assessment mechanisms being put into place. So moving on to freedom of expression. So at the layer of the telecommunications companies, of course, and anybody who, in the United States, you don't necessarily encounter these things so much kind of on the public internet, although you might in universities, a block page, 404 error, this page cannot be found. And so what we're looking for with telecommunications companies is transparency about what government demands they're receiving. Do they have a process for evaluating those demands? Are they only responding to lawful demands? Because governments sometimes make demands that aren't even in compliance with their own law. And with the telecommunications companies, when we ask how transparent are telecommunications companies about the handling of external demands to censor content and restrict accounts, you only really had 3 companies that disclosed much information just about their process for handling government demands. And the light green bar is showing that really there's only 2 companies among the telecommunication companies that provide any data at all about the number of requests they're getting and what they're responding to. So we have very low levels of transparency in the telecommunications sector about censorship and blocking demands. And when it comes to network shutdowns, also very little transparency, although you're seeing strong, meaningful improvement by Global Network Initiative telecommunications companies in terms of their efforts to be transparent about government shutdowns, network shutdowns, when a network is completely cut off in an entire region. Bharti Airtel in India, where there were like 64 shutdowns last year, very little information about what happens when they get a shutdown order, let alone the volume and nature of shutdowns that they're complying with. Coming to internet companies, we have, of course, many of you will be familiar with a post getting removed on Facebook or a video being blocked on YouTube in a particular jurisdiction, or in China, this is a block page, a very cute block page on Weibo, their equivalent of Twitter. And so the question is, how transparent are companies about that kind of thing at the platform level? Twitter and Facebook, these are examples of transparency reporting they've been doing. The transparency is best when it comes to reporting on government demands, although some companies, particularly Twitter and Google, report a lot of information about other types of demands, for instance, right to be forgotten, takedown requests in Europe. But Google's also been tracking government censorship demands for a long time, and you can see that spike in the volume of demands they've been getting over the past couple years. So this is one reason why having these transparency reports is so important, because you can see the patterns in what governments are demanding of companies. So this is the 2 indicators where we're looking at how transparent are the internet and mobile ecosystem companies about their rules and how they're enforced. So in addition to government demands or external demands, they're enforcing their terms of service. You know, people are flagging content, but they're also proactively taking down terrorist content or hate speech and other things. And there's a fair amount of transparency about what the rules are, but up until when we ended the research, there was a lot less transparency, a lot less reporting about the volume and nature of takedowns that are happening to enforce company terms of service. One thing that's really great is just 2 days ago, Google released a new transparency report for YouTube where they actually started releasing data on the volume of takedown requests on YouTube. And so like just in the last 2 months of 2017, there were like 8 million takedowns on YouTube to enforce the terms of service, and they have data about sort of the breakdown of the different types of content and so on. And so that's a really good step, and many of us have been kind of pushing this and sort of giving them bad scores for lack of transparency for a long time, so we're very encouraged. Also, the fact that Facebook just this week released a lot more information about its community guidelines and how those are enforced. Again, we're really pleased to see that and hope that we'll be able to, that this will reflect improved scores around those types of questions for the coming year. However, when you get to the questions in our privacy category about how transparent are companies about the handling of user information, so this again is the life cycle, what's being collected, with whom it's being shared, under what circumstances, how much control do people have. Interestingly, as of January, when we finished our comparative analysis, Twitter was disclosing the most information, but you'll see they didn't even really get a passing grade, right? They got an F. And everybody else is varying gradations of F below that. And you'll see that Facebook there, which is, you know, kind of in the back of its peer group as of January, you know, when its score was the same as AT&T, and all the telecommunications companies went down from there. So one of the things that people are not talking about so much is the fact that actually most telcos are way worse than Facebook when it comes to transparency about what's being collected and shared and used and how and so on. So so that's a debate worth beginning to have. In our so this indicator is looking specifically at transparency about from internet and mobile platforms about what user information is shared and with whom. Kakao, a Korean company where they have actually quite strong privacy regulation, performed much better than everybody else. And you'll see Google not so good. So when you go through the specific indicators, even though Google kind of on average is disclosing more information about more things, on some specific indicators that particularly get to its business model, you're seeing less disclosure. So that's kind of an interesting thing to drill down in the research. Let me see, this clicker is slightly, there we go. On the question that's what I like to call the Cambridge Analytica question, how transparent are internet and mobile ecosystem companies about options users have to control their own information? As of January, Facebook was dead last, behind 2 Chinese and 2 Russian companies. Now, they have since released some more information, and again, since we haven't done the thorough comparative analysis with all the companies, I can't tell you exactly how much their score would have improved based on what they have recently released. But my hypothesis, I think it's fair to say, it may have moved forward a little bit, but it has not put itself at the front of the pack. That a lot of the clarifications that released were just kind of rewording of existing policies and reorganizing. There have been a few meaningful improvements, but I wouldn't say enough to put them at the front. On another indicator related to privacy, how transparent are internet and mobile ecosystem companies about tracking users across the internet? This is where, you know, they're tracking what you're doing on other websites through cookies and beacons and other things. Facebook had the least transparency of everybody, and Apple was the only company that actually commits not to track you across the internet. So, so that's also something, you know, we should be looking for and asking companies to do a better job of. To the security questions, so we have a number of security questions. One of them is how transparent are companies about policies for responding to data breaches? So that's kind of the Equifax question. Apple was the only company in the internet and mobile space that discloses any sort of what its policies are for dealing with data breaches. And there were, you know, 3 telcos that disclosed something, but otherwise, companies are talking to regulators, but they're not talking to their users about what their policies are in this. Another security indicator, how transparent are companies about their security oversight processes? So are they doing third-party security audits of their systems? Kakao and Google on the internet and mobile side got full marks. Everybody else is pretty mediocre in the internet and mobile space, and AT&T was the only one to get full marks in the telco space. And of course, AT&T has other issues, as we all know from the Snowden documents, but at least when it comes to security breaches, they're taking it seriously and actually telling their users. So there's a lot more in the report and in the index, but I don't want to take up all the time. We have a number of recommendations throughout the report, kind of in the executive summary are the top line ones, but then in each chapter we get into more granular ones, and we have individual company report cards where we have recommendations for each company. So I recommend, you know, if you're interested in what we're telling Facebook it ought to do, or Twitter, or Telefonica, you can look at those report cards. But more broadly, we need to see strengthened governance and greater seriousness about risk assessment across the industry. And we need to see risk assessment not just around government demands, but around business practices and models, both in terms of service enforcement and how advertising is used, how data is used for advertising, and so on, and to do that in a human rights context. And we're not seeing enough of that. We need meaningful grievance and remedy mechanisms. One of the other announcements Facebook came out with this week was somewhat improved ability to actually seek remedy if a post is deleted, which hadn't been possible previously and was one of the reasons they had a very low score on that. But in general, grievance and remedy, the ability of users to be able to go to the company and say, you know, my rights have been violated as a result of something related to your business, and I need redress, is very poor. Transparency and accountability, been talking about that already, why it's important, why for all the companies, there are always some things that are hard to improve unless you have an improvement in law, and there are a number of legal obstacles that prevent companies from being transparent in many markets. But in every case, there are things companies could improve today without any legal or policy reform, and that we as advocates can be pushing them to improve. More information, more control over information and content for users. And we just also need to see more innovation. We need to see companies really thinking about, is this design, is this business model actually compatible with the kind of political and social and human rights framework that we want for ourselves and for our children? And companies are not asking those questions enough at the beginning. We also have recommendations for governments. Data protection laws are very important. We often see companies, particularly telcos, disclosing minimal information about what they're doing with data just because the law doesn't require them to. And so we need to impose more consequences on companies that fail to disclose information. We need government support for strong security and encryption. We need transparency and accountability by governments about the demands they're making to companies. And that is a huge failing. Pretty much across the board. And just generally, governments need to commit to maximize the ability of companies that they have jurisdiction over to respect users' rights. And again, we get into more details in our recommendations. So just to give you a quick preview, this is the website. You can go into the menu. You can look at every single indicator and how every company performed on every service for every indicator. You know, this is kind of a screenshot of one of the indicator things, and you can click on Facebook and see how it broke down with all the different services and all the elements. So you can get very granular in terms of what you're looking for. Next steps. Right now, we don't have questions about algorithms, artificial intelligence, or advertising overtly, other than the sharing of user data with advertisers. So we're thinking about how we can add questions to our methodology in the future that deal with these issues, and particularly risk assessment and transparency around these things. We also have partnerships. We're working with Consumer Reports. Tatev Sargsyan, who's here, is working directly with Consumer Reports to figure out how we apply parts of our methodology to evaluate Internet of Things. That's quite a messy, scary area in terms of respect for rights. And increasingly, there are NGOs and researchers around the world that are taking our methodology and adapting it locally. So from New York City, the New School did a report taking our methodology and evaluating ISPs in New York City. And we also, here's another example of social media exchange in Lebanon, evaluated telcos across the Arab region on their privacy policies. And, you know, it was kind of a abysmal story there. So we're encouraging people to take our methodology and adapt it to their own regions, their own issues. And that's it. And with that, I'm going to do my role of thanks. We have an incredible team, most of whom are not here because our team is distributed. So sitting in Budapest right now, we have Amy Brulette, our senior research manager, research and editorial manager. We have Lisa Gutermuth in Berlin, who's our program manager. We have Laura Reed, our senior research analyst, who is right here. Andrea Hackel, who's normally in DC, currently in Austria, is a research analyst as well. Tatev Sargsyan is a senior research fellow working with us on Consumer Reports. Then that's our team. So not a big team. We're also supported by New America's Open Technology Institute and particularly Allison Yost in communications. The Share Foundation did our website, which is their really fabulous group based in Serbia. And our funders, we do not take corporate funding. We are funded by 3 foundations, MacArthur, Ford, and Open Society Foundation, plus the State Department Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau Internet Freedom Program. So that's our funding. And I also want to thank just the incredible group of, there's a couple dozen researchers who've been collaborating with us and contributing to our research, without whom this index would not have been possible. So with that, I will sit down and we can talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. So just before I come to the other panelists, I just wanted to follow up. You could look at what you presented this morning and look at it in 2 ways. One of which is things are improving, and the other of which is most companies are failing. What's your personal view of how we should sort of calibrate our attitude to those 2 questions, those two positions?
That's a really good question, because it is both at the same time. And in a way, I like to think about this as the diagnostic test rather than the final exam, or this is the intermediary diagnostic test after we did the first one, you know.
Right.
And we've seen some improvement, but there's a long way to go. At the same time, some of the improvements we've seen have been genuinely meaningful. And what's encouraging, you know, we're all friends with the folks who do the Freedom House Index, is you benchmark governments and most of them don't care.
Right.
You benchmark companies and they actually, a lot of them care a lot. I mean, even the Chinese companies, I've heard from my sources, there are people in there who, you know, are telling their, in middle management who are like, we could do better than Baidu on that if we tried a little harder. And so, or vice versa. So companies, it's hard to prove, definitively, but I think there is we had something to do with the announcements earlier this week, along with a whole group of NGOs and scholars who have been giving companies a lot of grief for a long time about lack of transparency around how terms of service are enforced, and the companies have responded to that. So I think the good news is that if you point out to companies how they could do better, all of these companies are full of people who actually want their platforms and services to serve human rights and democracy, and certainly are appalled when they discover that that's not always the case. And they are sometimes in conflict with the marketing department or the PR people and the legal people who don't want to disclose anything because they're afraid of liability. And so one of the things that I think we found with this index is that we give ammunition to the people who want their company to be more transparent, who want their company to be more accountable, give them ammunition to get sort of resources and attention as they're sort of in competition with other parts of the company, with other commercial and sort of liability, priorities.
That's actually a good segue into a question I wanted to ask Anil, which is these changes. Rebecca outlined the ways that you get companies to change their behaviour. It is worth noting, and it's very much kind of explicit in your research, that without independent scholars, the kinds of work that you do, journalists, also independent journalists, we really wouldn't know half of what we know today about the problematic nature of our information environment. So it does sort of make me wonder, do you think the technology industry and telecoms industry have, Rebecca seems quite optimistic about their ability to be pressured into self-reformation, or do we need do we need regulation?
We need regulation, is the short answer. There's it's not a yes or no question, but I'll take it that way. Right. There's some complexity to it, right? I think, one, these are enormous organizations with many, many employees and many players, and so there's a complexity of feelings there. I know Silicon Valley best, and what I would sort of characterize there is the companies that run the major social platforms in the US, even more than the people wanting to do the right thing at those companies, they want to be seen as doing the right thing, right? And so that's an incredibly powerful form of pressure to put on these organizations. At the same time, there is no mechanism of consumer boycott, right? There is no lunch counter that you can boycott. So the idea of, people are saying sort of delete Facebook or erase your account. That doesn't delete their ability to create a profile about you and know about many of your activities and your actions. It just deletes your ability to be able to see some of it. And so there isn't actually any meaningful way to opt out of Facebook for anybody in basically the developed world right now. And so the fact that regulation and policy right now are essentially predicated around treating participation in social networks as if it were a consumer good that could be purchased or not is a structural flaw. And most policymakers and regulators globally are nowhere near fluent enough in that reality to make sweeping changes to consumer protection agencies and regulations around the world. That's a 50-year problem.
Right. I was going to say, so it's because there's a lot of, I'm sure that everybody on this panel has been subjected to some of the same meetings I've been subjected to, where you're suddenly invited to the West Coast to sit in, I call them my shadowy billionaire meetings, where people say, how do we fix this? And this idea...
I don't get invited to those anymore.
Oh, okay. I must do more of what you're doing, because I'm done with them. But that sudden interest in a category of tech entrepreneurs or rich people to say, hey, hang on a second, maybe we did create this problem and now we want to help solve it. Are those approaches, Anil, from what you were saying, it sounds as though this idea that you can somehow engineer a cultural problem is not useful.
It's part of it. I think it is. There are a large percentage of the day-to-day workers, not management, that want to get these things right, and they believe that's why they join those companies, and they're told by management that is what they're doing, right? And so the intentionality there is very high. When you get to ownership and board memberships on these companies, there's a divergence. There are still a lot of people that were very earnestly well-intended in that, when I started building social networks 15, 20 years ago, I didn't know the harms they would have, and I think some of the people from that same cohort, you sort of realize and you adapt. That takes time, and those harms are real, but they want to be addressed. And this is where this kind of report and the activism and education and journalism around those things can be very effective. I'm much more concerned with unapologetic bad actors.
Right.
I look at Peter Thiel being on the board of Facebook.
Yep.
And having unapologetically destroyed a journalistic organization through millions of dollars and many years of his own effort. That's so, and then to say, oh, I hope journalists report on that is sort of a ridiculous thing. There's already a chilling effect from journalistic organizations of they're not going to talk about Peter Thiel's activities or his what he's encouraging in terms of data retention policies or surveillance policies at Facebook unless they're absolutely rock solid, bulletproof sure that the ownership of their journalistic organization is willing to endure an existential threat to the publication.
And Thiel, incidentally, is actually one of the 3 members of the governance committee on the Facebook board as well, which I always find a fun fact that you can find buried in the back of the... I just wanted to bring Ellery in here to ask about this sort of journalistic question, because we were just talking before the panel and saying that the Reporters Without Borders have also brought out their index within the last, I think, 24 hours. Saying that actually, unlike the corporate index here, press freedom is really declining. And I just wondered, kind of, from your perspective of dealing on the ground, whether this idea that we're making progress actually feels at all real, because often when we sit in the journalism school and we look at what's happening to the organizations and the students that we graduate into the world, that really does not feel at all the case.
Yeah, so I think that touches on a couple of things, and one of them is how you count stuff, because this index is really new. A lot of the ways that we measure media freedom and rights are not as new, but the more internet people have, the more you're able to realize how many violations are happening all the time, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's good to be able to see that. But even, the indices, they're doing really hard, tough work to get as much data as they can. The regions of the world that are less connected to centers of power, like where we are right now, we don't get as much data from there. And I don't think that's because there aren't violations. I think it's just because people aren't connected. And I guess to think about that in connection with the index and with the companies, I'm really worried about small independent media and Facebook.
Right.
Deeply worried. And that starts at a really practical level of actually some of the challenges that Global Voices has had in the last year plus in making sure that our stories are actually reaching people who said they wanted to see what we were posting and writing about on the network, but also things like this Explore feed experiment that Facebook conducted, where people, I'm going to now forget which were the 6 countries.
I was going to say, if you forget, I have them here.
Rattle them off, please.
I think Slovakia, I'm now going to forget, Bolivia.
Sri Lanka was one of them.
Sorry, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Guatemala, and...
I'm missing one other.
That serves me right for boasting. I'll remember it in a minute. But yes, they are. And there are many more, actually, that weren't. But talk a little bit about the experiment.
Well, so there's this question now about what kind of information do Facebook users want to see now that there's this, to me it feels still sudden, a big concern about misinformation and disinformation in news and in advertisements that might look like news. The company started experimenting with removing a lot of that, a lot of news content, and giving people more just posts from family and friends. And what that resulted in was an effect where if you follow a page, the page might be connected to an NGO, it might be a small media outlet, you're not gonna see their updates. You'll still see updates from media outlets and others that buy ads. So it was really upsetting for us and for so many of our colleagues around the world who operate really small NGOs and small media organizations on a really tight budget that absolutely can't buy space or buy representation on Facebook. And they depend on these networks of readers and supporters not only to to pay attention to what they're saying, but to actually provide them with information. So it was like they were suddenly losing contact with a lot of readers and supporters. We had a great story about the direct effects of that in Cambodia,
right,
where there was an election coming up and a lot of disinformation going out in media that did have the resources to buy ads. Meanwhile, the smaller outlets that were trying to really show what different candidates were doing, what they were saying or not saying about their activities, users weren't even seeing their stories.
Right, because I think it's still outside journalism. I think people are still surprised, despite all of the coverage, that actually you need now to pay to promote your story for anybody to see it on Facebook. We've, at the Town Centre, we're in a 2-year project looking at platforms and publishers, and it's definitely the case that there are local publishers, even in the States, who have to pay more to Facebook to get their story seen than they would ever get in advertising from them. So that's a structural issue, I guess, that sometimes won't show up in the kind of, when you talk about algorithms, are these the kinds of things
That's
that we
the kind of
should be
thing.
having to?
Like one of the questions we're asking ourselves now is, so what are the standards? So if you were to list the things that you want Facebook and other companies that are kind of using algorithms and other curation methods to determine what you see on the front page,
right,
on your landing page or whatever. What are the things we want them to disclose that would enable us to say Facebook is being responsible and transparent to its users about how their newsfeed is governed? Right? And all the different factors that go into what you can see. And then ideally, of course, they should also be providing information about how you can change it so that you see what you want, right? And so what do we want? What are the things we want disclosed so that people can understand this? And what are the mechanisms we want companies to provide to give people more control? And I think that requires, so in order to kind of add an indicator and give them a score and say they got a B on transparency about, the news feed, we need to figure out kind of, and this, one of the reasons we did the ranking is sometimes, I'd have conversations with companies just saying, you're not, you're doing a lousy job at X. And then they would say, well, what specifically should we change in order to be considered to be doing a better job? And that's where, sometimes in the conversation, you're like, blah, 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 I'm not sure. And so that's kind of one reason, one of the many reasons we do the ranking is to equip people with very specific answers to that. And I think with questions about newsfeed and algorithms and transparency around content curation, I think we're still in a phase where we as civil society, we as people in kind of public interest news and information ecosystem, what are our demands, right? What is our list of things we want them to do differently? And I think it would be ideal if we could spend, I don't think we may not figure out that answer, in the next 3 months in time to get it into our 2019 methodology, but I think it's a real priority to spend the coming year working with people to figure out what that list of questions is, and so that, because the key thing too is that companies kind of see this coming from, so, hopefully they'll start improving even before you start grading them,
Yeah.
But it's a tough question in terms of what specifically we want them to do.
Yeah, that level of specificity of goals and the technical fluency that it takes is the biggest thing I would love to see from accountability organizations, from activists, because there's a tendency, especially in journalistic and academic contexts, to treat transparency and disclosure as the end goal.
Right.
And I see this of the sort of, there's the belief that sunlight is the best disinfectant without paying attention to sunlight also being the way that weeds grow. And so there's this thing that happens where we say, well, we're going to have disclosure, and we're going to reveal the algorithm that says this is why this content was in your feed, right? And if Facebook says, okay, we've done that, and the answer is because they paid, what do you do, right? Like, all right, we got it. They had the most money, and therefore that's the information that I saw, and accuracy was not a factor, and now I know that. We already know that. If I pull back the curtain and, that's the guy, and it's not the great and powerful Oz, what do you do next?
Right.
And and I think that is actually the realm even more of activists. Like, I think the role of advocacy in journalistic organizations is to be that mediator that enables this thing. Activists, I'm sort of struck, there is no grand ask, right? And we see this across tech. So people say, in tech, what do we want to do about issues of diversity and inclusion? They're like, we want to fix them, okay. And, well, what do we want? We want it to be better. And it's like, well, we hired, 1 woman on the board, and we hired, 1 person of color in senior management. That we did it, so now you have more, right? And instead saying, like, the commitment should look like, and I always come back to this on Facebook, they acquired WhatsApp, and I think it's one of the most brilliant strategic things they've done. This is the messaging app of the world, and an incredibly smart move. And by the time that deal closed, the acquisition of WhatsApp was worth about $22 billion for a team of about 30 people. And the founder got a seat on the board. And they made the decision to go from considering that deal to being approved by the board, even as a publicly traded company with nominal oversight, in about 4 or 5 days. So if you can deploy $22 billion for something that's strategically important to a company in about half a week, that's what it looks like when you care about something.
Yeah.
So what should the request look like if we say Facebook ought to be made to care about disclosure of user tracking? If the commitment is anything less than the scale of that, it's not important to them yet.
So this is a question just to follow up and put back to Ellery as well, which is because we chew over this a lot, which is in terms of small independent media, or even just accountability reporting, in larger organizations, what is it we should be asking for, apart from money, which I like to ask for on a frequent basis from them?
Emily, that's so hard.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's a hard question.
Well, I think part of the challenge is, and to just focus on Facebook, it's huge. I mean, the hearings a couple weeks ago in the U.S. Congress made it super clear that while some members of Congress still literally don't know what Facebook is and does, some of them really know a lot, and they're still asking. Lindsey Graham is trying to figure it out in a pretty, I thought, sharp way. And I mean, one of the questions that I guess, I'll try to come around to an answer. But
that's okay.
But one thing that I kind of want to push at Rebecca a little bit is Facebook as an enabler of access to the internet or access to communication services. I mean, WhatsApp is free. It's 0 rated in a lot of different places. The internet.org umbrella of projects and programs and services that Facebook has rolled out over the last few years. One of them is called Free Basics. Global Voices did a set of case studies on that, and it's a program, really unique program, where Facebook partners with a telco to give people some free access to some websites and services, including those that belong to Facebook. And in doing that research, I mean, it became really apparent to us, well, if you become the avenue for how people are getting online, and you're a really good way to get news, so now you're providing the access, you're providing the way that people communicate, and your algorithms are still deciding what news people are going to see in the free basics version of Facebook, which, by the way, makes it really hard to verify news and to check and see if it's legit or not. That was super, super clear. So to look at all of that, that's just one area. And to say, what's the ask?
Well, but you bring up such an important point, because I do feel I'll be interested in both Anil and Rebecca on this, that frontier of the smaller markets that we have not really been looking at, both globally, the people that you work with, Ellery, all the time, that we don't tend to sort of think about, but even local press organisations here, if you like, the information asymmetry that can be created by the kinds of actions that you're talking about are really hard to examine, because it's not just the press, is it? It's also the government becomes the press. And if you have influence, so for instance, in the Philippines, you have influencers who are checkmarked and who presumably work at some level with Facebook, and they may be spreading Duterte's messages. How does that weigh up against what's happening to independent journalists in the country? I don't know whether there's a kind of a...
Well, so this is tough. We've kind of, when we were putting our methodology together, we have an indicator that looks at disclosure around kind of what we call net neutrality, so are the telcos disclosing, the extent to their prioritizing content and data flows on their services. We don't have a question in there around zero rating, in part because at the time when we put the methodology together, it was sort of just very unclear sort of what the ask is. And we need to keep going back to that and, sort of what types of, is it really about disclosure? We do also have indicators where you're looking for both disclosure and practice. So you get some credit if you disclose, but you don't get full credit unless it's good practice. We have a lot of indicators like that. And so around zero rating, do we just don't want companies to do it, or do we want it done in a particular way? And sort of what should that look like? I think, again, just to kind of go back to a few other things, it's funny that I'm sort of the optimistic one here, because
you've invited the wrong panel.
Or kind of described as the optimistic one, because I'm pretty pessimistic about where governments are going these days, and where political systems are going. And you saw that one thing where Google is showing the number of government censorship demands it's getting has just spiked up in the last 2 years. And so you have these intermediaries that governments, in part governments are attacking independent civil society, attacking independent media, because the internet has fostered so much success. And it took a while for many governments to kind of wake up to, how people could use these platforms to challenge them, and the fact that, the dissident publication that can't get published in, Mozambique, can be seen on Facebook. And so, and so these becoming increasingly choke points, and kind of what do you do? The companies, I think the level of pressure that the companies have come under just in the past 2 years has spiked tremendously. I think they're getting pressure from governments that weren't paying attention to them up until recently. And so I think the companies don't really know what to do in a lot of cases, and they're trying to be more transparent, but there are a lot of problems with many of the orders that they're complying with, as Global Voices often, and advocacy often reports, in Thailand and, many other places. And so I think, continuing to come back to this question of, and we struggled with this in the Global Network Initiative when we started it. It's like, what are the guidelines for, what you do when the government comes to you and says, this is the law, you have to comply for it, or you have to leave. And in most countries, with the exception of China and a couple other places, most companies have decided it's better that they stay in than go out. But I think we need to continue to revisit and kind of have a dialogue with the companies about what we want them to do differently than what they're doing, or, and also just, it of course comes back down to the politics of countries where you have this kind of negative feedback cycle where platforms are being manipulated to result in politics that cause civil society to be attacked even more. And so, yeah, but just one other point, just to dispel any misperception of anything I said, I'm not saying that having an index is going to solve all of these problems. My point is that having an index is one kind of animal in a very big ecosystem that we need to continue to build out. And there's some things that kind of lend themselves, some types of practices and disclosures that lend themselves to being kind of benchmarked in this way, and a lot of other things that better lend themselves to the kind of research that Global Voices Advocacy did on zero rating or other things. We need a lot more groups doing a lot more in-depth research and investigation and kind of working together to figure out what are the asks? What does better look like? And what do we want the companies to do to get to that? What do we want the governments to do to get to that? And what are the steps forward? Because one of the problems we have seen through our work is that a lot of NGOs in many countries are pretty adept now at kind of policy work and both researching and lobbying around legal reform and policy, but do not have much experience and do not do much work on the company side.
Right.
So like what companies are doing in their countries and how to engage with the companies. And it's surprising when you hear in many countries that a lot of NGOs that work on digital rights full time have never talked to the major telcos in their country.
So this goes back to Anil's point about fluency and fluency in business and fluency in technology. Anil, you said, without a shadow of a doubt, we need regulation. When one looks at the FCC at the moment, and even after the hearings on Capitol Hill, we surely don't hold out much hope of any regulation happening here
certainly
in
not
the short
thoughtful
term.
regulation. Yeah,
Right.
and I think to sort of amplify the key point, like the index is an essential tool. We need to have that information. That's the foundation to be able to do these other efforts. And well, one of the things I would say is I would caution that regulation doesn't have to be federal regulation in the U.S., right? We have a lot of power at state and local levels. I mean, you look at what California's done on auto regulation and emissions,
Right.
And there's no reason it can't have the same power around the internet, and especially with most of the major internet players being based there.
Right.
So I think one is to sort of, for the foreseeable future, write off what can happen at the federal level in the U.S. Because it's not functional. And then I think the other parts I would sort of call out to is, I think you'd said it's difficult to know what the remedies are. It often is, but sometimes we sort of can look at models that have existed. There have been open parts of the internet. There has been places of free expression prior to corporate capture, regulatory capture, and all these other things. And I think Free Basics is such an instructive example. And I know it best in the context of India having family there. But the debate, that happened in India was essentially a net neutrality argument, right? Is this, if you're going to provide access, we should be able to get to these other sites and services. What was interesting was how it played out here in the U.S. because, again, you go to leadership and management, like, as a board member of Facebook said, Mark Andreessen was like, anti-colonialism is the worst thing that ever happened to India. And, which he said on Twitter, which must have really angered Zuckerberg. Like, at least say it on Facebook. But the thing that sort of jumped out to me, right, because you want to boost your page views? The thing that jumped out to me is,
He's also on the governance committee of Facebook as well, just as a...
Yeah. This is where the accountability comes from, these guys. And, my father having been born a British subject in India, and he's still alive, I was like, oh, it's not some theoretical, conceptual thing. This is people's lived experience in like current lifetimes. And I said sort of that to Zuckerberg on the comments of his Facebook post. And, I think he sort of engaged with that thoughtfully, but that fluency was not there in reverse, right? Like, he sort of doesn't know the context of, if you think building the railroads was a lot of control, imagine building the entire media ecosystem and internet delivery, and especially because free basics is the kind of thing that by nature is isolated from the ruling class, right? They have their own internet access, so whose media access you're controlling is the people that already had the least economic power, the least political power. It's very straightforward to understand that. And then we say, well, what does a remedy look like? Well, it's funding public alternatives.
Yep.
Right? And that's not like some wild-eyed, unimaginable, unprecedented solution. Like, we have done that over and over and over around the world. Cultures and countries have done that. And now, is the inclination of those governments in all those countries to do that all the time? No, they want to centralize control, and we understand that. But if we're going to say, as American companies often do, well, we have to be there because we're going to open them up, which is the sort of, head-patting paternalism that we're sort of prone to as technologists a lot of times. They're going to make that argument, right? The big platforms are going to make that argument. Then we say, all right, well, what are you doing to make public and open infrastructure? Because without that, you don't mean it. That's the only reasonable, thoughtful, like coherent demonstration of those values. And that's the thing. It's not outrageous. It's not unreasonable to say we want to provide tools. I think of when Global Voices started, right? I was making publishing tools, and it was technology that you purchased, and then you had no accountability to us as a vendor of that technology. We didn't track how people used it. We didn't know how people used it. We didn't know, it was something that you could take and build a community globally and get their voices out there, put something out there without any surveillance and without any tracking and without, and with independence about what your sustainability model was going to be.
Right. So
that's not science fiction. That already happened.
Yeah, we shouldn't be surrendered to the idea that the Facebook newsfeed is a natural state of being. It's a natural state of being. I want to come to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, I think we have microphones. Though to be honest, my eyesight is so bad.
Colleagues monitoring Twitter, so there could also
Right. So there may be questions as well from Twitter, which. Did we have a question down?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
I'm just going to ask you to, if you're not speaking, please turn off the microphone so that we're not going to have a sound explosion. Thank you. And please state your name and affiliation before you speak.
Jack Snyder, the Columbia Political Science Department. I know you didn't rate Wikipedia, but I want to ask you a couple of questions about that just to get a sense of how the ranking system works. So would it be the case that if you looked at Wikipedia, they would get good points for vetting the accuracy of content, or would they get marked down for trying to censor people saying what they want to about the Armenian genocide, say? Or is all that completely irrelevant, and what just counts is whether Wikipedia has clear rules about how it vets accuracy of content? And if it's the latter, could you justify a little more strongly why you think transparency is such a valid criterion in your ranking system?
Okay.
Great questions. So we made a decision that we are ranking the major listed companies. So we're kind of, because if you start ranking nonprofits, it's sort of kind of a different model. And perhaps somebody should go and rank nonprofit media organizations as well in a separate project. I also think news organizations should be, there's an adaptation of our methodology that could rank news organizations about what they're doing with user data, among other, and how they're moderating comment sections and various other things. But the questions would look a bit different, and I think because the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the organizational entity that houses Wikipedia, it's a different, it's not a listed corporation that we'd have to approach its evaluation differently. So that's one major reason they're not in the index. Their transparency reporting is really very good. So, I hypothesize if they had been in the index, they would get very high marks, kind of on both transparency around user data and around both in terms of government requests that they get, but also what they're taking down and how their rules are enforced and so on. So to answer your question, would they get lower marks because because they have rules and enforce them? No. As I mentioned earlier, we approach freedom of speech basically from the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 19. Freedom of speech is not an absolute right. You do not have a right to organize a massacre of the students over there with your speech. So the point is that there needs to be governance. Right? If you don't have governance of speech, life is nasty, brutish, and short on the internet, and the most powerful speaker wins, and everyone else loses, and is threatened both physically and as well as virtually. So if you're looking at freedom of speech in a human rights context, you do need rules, you do need governance. The question is the governance accountable, and is it transparent? So in other words, do you know on what basis are the rules being formulated? And in the case of the Wikimedia Foundation and Wikipedia, it's the community that develops the rules, right? Also, are they being accountable about how they're enforced? And is there a process for appeals and so on? So those are the kinds of things you're looking at, rather than, which platform allows the most speech generally and has the less rules. That does not get you high marks in our index.
We've got another two questions here, I think.
I'm Mike Nelson with Cloudflare, a web security firm. So, Rebecca, suppose a tech billionaire writes you a check tomorrow and you can do 2 or 3 times as much work.
I can't take it.
Okay, suppose a foundation writes you a check that allows you to double or triple the work you're doing. What other companies would you look at? In particular, you're looking at the ISPs and the social media platforms, but there's domain name companies, there's a lot of other people.
There's all kinds of companies.
And have you looked at any of the small companies that are trying to do everything right, the ones that nobody knows about?
Great questions.
Good question.
So first of all, we do not take money from any corporate entity that is either runs or is affiliated with anything we currently rank or might rank in the future. So kind of the tech sector broadly is out, just to clarify that. In terms of resources, our top priority, just to be pretty specific, because we get the questions the most of why isn't Amazon there? Why isn't Alibaba there? And so I think in terms of adding platforms, those are probably the priority. The reason why they're not there, other than that we only had the resources to do 22, is that we'd have to modify our methodology because the nature of those businesses is somewhat different, and the impact they have on speech and privacy is also somewhat different. So if we add them, which I hope we might be able to do, I can't make a commitment. We will need to tweak our methodology to make sure that we can evaluate them. In terms of other companies, I mean, I would love to see somebody do an index. I think it needs to be a separate index on, domain name, registrars and registries, web hosting companies. There's a whole universe of many different types of companies and categories of companies that one could rank, probably not necessarily all in the same index, but our methodology is public. We don't have to do it all, right? So that's the other thing. Maybe the funder, we could use some more resources to actually support. I'd like to add a few more companies, but what I'd really like to be able to do is support an ecosystem of other organizations and projects that do the that do the web hosting company ranking, that do the startup small company ranking, that rank the Arab world service providers on a regular basis, that rank the providers in sub-Saharan Africa are the most, and so I think a lot of it has to do with how do we support an ecosystem so you don't have dependency on one organization and its ability to fundraise in order to have an ecosystem of researchers and NGOs that are doing detailed research and trying to hold companies accountable with facts, and that's where kind of doing this kind of ranking really helps, because you can go to an ISP and say, you didn't disclose anything about this and your competitor did, why aren't you?
Can I jump in real quick
Yeah,
on
sure.
just the sort of small
yeah.
organizations question? I mean, obviously I run a small company, so I have a dog in this fight, but it's true of open source teams that are not even companies or whatever. There are entities doing this work and being thoughtful about it. I mean, we have these conversations every day in our team of how do you build a business without any advertising or any surveillance as a component of how you, and it's possible. Our company's been around 18 years. This isn't, again, like it's not science fiction. These are things that are very doable. We're older than Facebook, we're older than Twitter. Like, you can do these things. And especially like, to architectures of accountability, you talk about Wikipedia. Like, open source is not some panacea that sort of solves all these problems, but if you wanted to design a system where you could at least understand the algorithm and be able to have higher trust that it wasn't tampered with by a governmental organization, by the corporation itself, or for profit, open source helps to encourage that, right? There is a lot of thought, a lot of work that's been done on these things, and they don't have voice. And I think with good reason, there's a lot of attention being paid to the criticism of the big platforms, of the Facebooks of the world. Like, we should do that. That accountability is really important. But because it is sort of zero-sum attention, there isn't voice in media and culture to, here is a good entity doing the right thing. Here are other products, services, tools you can use. I do lament, I mean, I always come back to that WhatsApp example, because for a long time they were independent. They said they never wanted to have advertising. They had a very clear direct revenue model. If you could think of the worst sort of undermining of a well-designed product by a coercive product, it would be Facebook acquiring WhatsApp. That is the moment that sort of messaging for the world turned from probably the best, most equitable model to the least.
Question there. Sorry, I've been trying to get just right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joelle Fiss, Independent Research. I very much enjoyed your panel, especially the question that you asked about the ask, basically, what to ask. But of course, obviously that concerns social media companies in particular. I'd like to take my question to the other side, which is the government side, what to ask the governments. And so traditionally you have the US saying, oh, we are the defender of freedom of expression in the world, and we are on your side. And so I'm sure that you hear that discourse quite frequently, and I'd like you to comment on that. And then the Europeans that say, oh, but we are on the side of the international standards on freedom of expression. As Rebecca was saying, we represent the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have all these different entities conveying different messages, and all, well, especially the US and the EU saying that they're on your side. And I'd like to know, how do you deal with this? What are the discussions? Where do you stand on all these questions with governments? And if you would sort of support a world order of sorts for governments to
Are you asking for the kind of...
I don't want the United Nations to take over the internet.
I was going to say, so there are people like David Kay who does want the United Nations, or
No,
like
he doesn't.
He wants a
thinks that
separate body like
he
the
wants
UN. UN for...
It's more complicated than that.
Right, okay, but it's a sorry for my journalistic shorthand. I mean, it's a good question about governments. Ellery, can I ask you? You deal again with governments.
Yeah, so I guess there are a lot of different governments. The one here, I'm deeply concerned about the state of freedom of expression in the United States. I don't think it's ever been anywhere near as good as the talk and as the promotion around the world. But now that's just sort of openly the case. We have a president who really doesn't want the press around, doesn't want media freedom. Again, at the congressional hearings a couple of weeks ago with Mark Zuckerberg, there was a lot of talk about collaboration, like, oh, we should partner together to write some legislation. That really scares me. I don't like the way that sounds. And the truth is, if the United States is to regulate companies, they're regulating them for the world. And I really, wow, there's a lot, and that I sort of had a little ear perk up moment of thinking, gosh, we have to gather up and really get this sector, there's a global digital rights advocacy sector of NGOs. There's a few people here who I interact with regularly in that capacity, to get our shit together and figure out how to actually communicate, figure out what are the priorities, the 3 things we care about most, and talk to the Congress here if they're serious about regulation, because they're not going to build laws for the world, but that's effectively what will happen. And then as to the rest of the world, there's so many different questions coming up. We've been doing a lot of work in Brazil lately. We have a really strong editor there, and she's been looking at all of these instances in which government entities are taking the companies to court over specific kinds of content, and the sort of question about whether public figures can have special privileges in the way that they use social media, if it's okay to block citizens on your Facebook page if you're the mayor of Sao Paulo, so there's sort of a wide range of questions still to direct at every government, but I do think that thinking about the United States and actually China and Russia and the EU and what kind of advocacy can be done in a really direct manner is something that we have to get organized on.
Yeah.
We are more or less up to, I think we are, sorry, I've got one of these stupid watches which is tracking everything that I do every second of the day, which incidentally is not very much. So I usually find my phone. So I just wanted to sort of end on one note, which is a very quick across the panel of going back, sorry, Ellery, to the ask, which is if there's one thing that we could change, maybe a small way for next year when we all come back hopefully and discuss, what would it be? Rebecca, you're driving this ship.
Man, that's a tough one I didn't prepare for.
That's why I asked it.
I really want to see companies stand up and to really say, not just we want to protect your freedom of expression and privacy, but to really articulate how they want their companies to support and sustain the kind of society that we want, to make a commitment to support freedom of expression, to commit to support and build technologies and businesses that are compatible with the kind of accountable governance and open societies that we assume they want their children to live in, just as they're committing to, clean energy and all that kind of thing. We need sustainability commitments for democracy and open society, and we're not seeing that.
Great answer for an unprepared one. Anil?
Each one of these organizations should commit to personalized reporting on each of the factors in the accountability index to every user and non-user of their platforms, with substantial financial penalties per transgression for any users that they don't provide those reports to.
Great. Actionable.
Succinct.
It's succinct.
Communicate with your users and do so in the languages that they speak.
Right.
Get multilingual in your terms, in all of the guidance on how to handle different kinds of reporting, harassment, all of these issues. Get multilingual, and get multilingual in your moderation.
Fantastic. I hope they're watching. Thank you so much, Rebecca and team, but also thank you very much indeed for a terrific panel, and thank you for being engaged right up to the coffee break. So thanks very much indeed. That was great. That was great. That was